What would make Borderlands 4 perfect? It's a tough question and one that a lot of people would probably have a different answer to. But I love these games and I've played them a ton, so I'm going to give you my breakdown of how I'd make Borderlands 4 perfect. When it comes to Borderlands, I think we can break down the game into 4 key aspects, those being story, difficulty, gameplay, and the loot system. Each one of these contributes to how interesting the game is, how replayable the game is, how much depth the game has, and overall how enjoyable it is. We're going to be going over all of these aspects and talk about how I would design each one to make the best game possible. Let's start off with the story. Now, we're not going to be going over specific plot points in this section, but instead talk about how I want the story to feel and overall more so the tone of the story, as well as things like how long it takes to complete. When replaying the games for this video, I found that my favorite part about the story is the lighthearted, comedic style that a lot of the series has. Borderlands 2, the pre-sequel, and Wonderlands do this pretty well. Borderlands 1 doesn't really have enough story overall, and Borderlands 3 seemed to try to be more serious through its longer story, although the recent Katagawa Jr. sections are fantastic. Length of the story is the next most important thing. The story length is important for the replayability of the game. You want the story to feel fun and engaging, but not so overly long that it feels like a slog to get through. I think Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel hit the story length pretty well. They feel just long enough that I enjoy replaying it, and it doesn't feel like a chore to get through. Borderlands 3, on the other hand, feels entirely too long. There are times I wanted to make a new character in Borderlands 3, but didn't want to go through the whole story again, and that legitimately stopped me from playing the game. An interesting point here is that even though in Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel, you have to play through the story 3 times, once in normal mode, once in true Vault Hunter mode, and once more in ultimate Vault Hunter mode, I'd rather do that than play through the Borderlands 3 story, which you only have to do once, which should highlight the idea that a longer story doesn't necessarily mean a better story. The last thing I want to talk about story-wise is the experience of playing through the story, meaning what sort of objectives you should expect to encounter during the story missions. In Borderlands 3, one of the biggest complaints is the amount of times you have to talk to Lilith. It's a chore, it's not a fun thing to do, so that should be avoided. If I do have to talk to an NPC, let me talk to them and then immediately start heading to my next objective instead of waiting for them to finish talking before allowing me to go to that objective. Another point of interest to me is required mobbing sections. What I mean by this is objectives where you reach an area and then have to clear all the enemies before progressing. Borderlands 3 also has a lot of these, and to me this leads to a very repetitive story experience. For most of Borderlands 3, you're stuck in a cycle of talk to / follow NPC, go to area, clear all the enemies, talk to the NPC, and then repeat. Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel had a lot more areas that your only objective was reach the end of the map. The maps are still filled with enemies that you can kill if you want to, but they're not required to be killed to progress. Structuring the objectives like this allows for more types of gameplay for the player. If you want to kill every single enemy in the map, you're still able to do that, but if it's your 10th time playing through the game and you just want to get through the story, you can skip most of the enemies and progress at your own pace. Now, not every single mission needs to be structured like this, but I feel like most of them should be, and overall I see almost no downside to this sort of structure for the mission design, because realistically it just lets you play the game how you want to play as opposed to being told how you have to play the game. Overall, what I'm looking for in the Borderlands 4 story is a mostly casual comedic plotline, a story length between 10 to 15 hours for a casual or first time playthrough that's closer to 3 or 6 hours for an optimized playthrough, and a mission structure that caters to multiple ways to play the game. But now let's move on to difficulty. Difficulty through the series has seen many iterations. We've seen multiple playthroughs, OP levels, mayhem levels, and chaos levels. The unfortunate part of all these is that none of them were entirely perfect, although I think one of these was better than the rest. That is Borderlands 2 and its approach to difficulty. In Borderlands 2, there is normal mode, true Vault Hunter mode level 50, ultimate Vault Hunter mode level 80, and 10 OP levels that are each individual places that feel good to stop and experience the game, or in other words, play the endgame. The sheer variety of difficulty levels should cater to just about everyone in terms of how you want to play the game. Normal mode serves as the perfect place for the most casual play, the people who are looking to play the story, play the DLCs, and then move on from the game. True Vault Hunter mode level 50 is perfect for people who are interested in making a build and playing with a bunch of the different items in the game without necessarily looking for a big challenge. UVHM level 80 is perfect for the people that want a definitive hard mode in the game. And the OP levels serve as the ultimate challenge for the player, where they can test out every bit of optimization and skill expression the game has. Now, of course, like I said, no difficulty system has been perfect, but BL2 accomplished what I think is one of the most important parts of a difficulty system, that is catering to a wide variety of playstyles. This should be the goal of a difficulty system. You want as many people as possible to have a place they enjoy playing the game at. Oddly, one of the things I think the series as a whole has failed at is the naming scheme for difficulties. So many times have I heard players complain about the difficulty of a mode because they didn't expect it to be as hard as it is. Look at the pop-up you get going into UVHM in Borderlands 2. Nothing here tells you how much more difficult UVHM will be in comparison to TVHM. In fact, it only has one word of difference between the UVHM and the TVHM pop-up. Looking at this as a first-time player, this would tell me I should be expecting a pretty similar curve in difficulty as I experienced going from normal to True Vault Hunter mode, which is not correct. UVHM is significantly harder than what you experience in TVHM. If UVHM was just called Super Hard mode, or something like Omega Death mode, players would be able to instantly identify that this is going to be a much harder experience and can temper their expectations appropriately. This is a recurring issue to this day, where players go into UVHM thinking it's just the next step in progression, when in reality it's a mode designed for players that want a significant increase in difficulty, ultimately leading to a problem where players are playing at the wrong difficulty for what they enjoy. This I feel like can be avoided by just giving better descriptions and relatable names to the difficulties. I do want to spend a little time talking about how I want the experience of playing at the hardest difficulty to be. This is the difficulty I prefer to play on in each game. OP10, Mayhem 11, Chaos 100, whatever it is, that's where I log the majority of my time in the series. One thing that I think the more recent titles have been lacking is a relation of skill to difficulty at these levels. If we look at Borderlands 3 for example, the way Mayhem 11 is scaled is purely DPS based. Given that enemies only increase in overall health, all that it asks of the player is that they deal more damage. Meaning the game doesn't really get that much harder, it pretty much only asks that you have a more optimized build. If you get better guns, or better build, or better anointments, or all three, you will win, assuming you're good enough to beat them at no Mayhem level. This to me is a problem, as it means the game is not that much more difficult at the hardest level compared to the easiest level. I think there needs to be a better balance at the hardest difficulty, where your average player with meta or near meta setup can still struggle, but as they progress and get better at the game, they will be able to make any setup work. Success at the hardest difficulty shouldn't be decided solely based on what your gear or build is. Skill should be a factor at this level, because it gives players reason to improve at the game for those who want that experience. Overall, what I'm looking for is a difficulty system that offers a variety of ways to play and ranges from casual story playthrough levels of difficulty, where you can pretty much do whatever you want, to a legitimate very hard mode that tests not only build and gear, but also your skill at the game. It's time to look at the gameplay. This includes the combat loop, the loot loop, and how everything combines to be the gameplay loop. We'll only be touching on the loot system here, as that will be covered in detail in the next section. Let's start with the combat loop. This is arguably one of the most important and hardest things to get right. That's because it's directly relative to the difficulty problem, where different skill and interest levels of player will want different combat loops. Some players are satisfied with pointing a strong gun at the enemies, clicking shoot, and activating their action skill, while others prefer high amounts of inputs and managing several resources at once. Neither are right or wrong ways to do the combat loop. They are simply relative to how the player wants to play the game. I think the best way to handle the combat loop is to increase in complexity as you progress to the harder difficulties. A more complex combat loop would be harder to do consistently, which is in turn would be part of what makes the higher difficulties harder. If we look at Borderlands 2 as an example, in True Vault Hunter mode you can ignore slag as a mechanic entirely, but by Overpowered 10, you almost need to factor it into your combat loop. This is where I think anointments in Borderlands 3 fail as a concept. They don't add anything to the combat loop, as they are directly tied to the basic things you'd be doing anyway on any difficulty. There are 84 different kinds of regular anointments in the game, 72 of which are tied to using action skills. The other 12 are tied to things like killing an enemy, or getting consecutive hits, or throwing a grenade. Basically other things that are just playing the game. Point being that they don't add to the combat loop, meaning they don't make combat more interesting. I think that playing at the hardest difficulty, combat should easily be 3 to 4 times more complex than playing on the easiest difficulty. Now, Borderlands 4 doesn't necessarily need slag or moxie weapons to add this complexity. I think it can be done through a variety of ways. It can be tied to the player character and their skills, or tied to enemies, or it could be a new mechanic as a whole. But something needs to be added to make combat at higher difficulties more complex to keep it interesting for the people that want a challenge. Let's move on to the loot loop. This being how players acquire loot and how frequently. This is another thing that will differ extremely based on preference. In my opinion, the player should, on average, naturally come across 2 to 3 legendary weapons in a standard normal mode playthrough, one of which could be guaranteed from the final boss. Having legendary drops be rare is key to that special feeling associated with them. Now, this doesn't mean that players will be exclusively using normal guns through their playthrough, as I believe players should also be coming across blue or purple unique weapons more commonly through the playthrough. Maybe 5 to 10 non-legendary uniques should be expected for the player to come across. This gives players fun tools to use and shows them that these special weapons exist. It should go without saying that blue and purple unique weapons should also be less powerful than legendaries, so outside of these unique items, I'd say average items should start to fall off every 3 to 5 levels. This encourages players to try different items and not get too attached to an individual item, so much so that they ignore the other loot they might be getting. For uniques and legendary items, it should be more like 5 to 7 levels. This of course is dependent on how many levels normal mode would cover in the span of the story. I'm going off about 30 levels for these numbers. For the overall gameplay loop, I feel like replayability is the key. Your progression should be make a new character, play the story, earn and unlock your preferred endgame difficulty through story replays or endgame challenges, play the game fully at your desired endgame level, farm the gear you want, defeat the endgame challenges you want, and then make a new character. That should be the standard progression for players looking for the full experience the game has to offer. I touched on this briefly in the last section, but it's time to go over the loot system. First and foremost, every unique item should have a different dedicated drop location. This means there should be no enemies with crowded loot pools, with the exception of raid bosses, but I'll talk about how they can be crowded and still rewarding. Crowded loot pools suck, and it feels bad when you're farming a normal enemy or boss, and they drop a legendary and it's not the one you're looking for. By not having crowded loot pools, you'll avoid this as a common occurrence. Now let's talk about drop rates. Unique items below legendary should have a 33% drop rate. Legendaries should be a 10% drop rate. Pearls, Seraph, Effervescent, or whatever other rarities they add should work differently than standard. Pearls should be obtainable in a way where they are fun to farm and the primary point of the item is its incredible rarity. Pearls should be more for collection as opposed to being meta gear. The strongest gear in the game should not be the rarest items. This is because the game should be balanced around its strongest items, which would mean the strongest items that are the rarest to get would be more difficult than they should be to obtain. Also, having the strongest gear being easier to obtain lowers the barrier of entry into harder difficulties for newer players, giving them something to crutch on while they learn to play at the higher levels. For raid bosses, I'd be happy to see Seraphs, or at least the concept of Seraphs, return. A raid boss having 1 to 3 drops and being guaranteed to get one every kill is a perfect idea. Raid bosses, or whatever is the equivalent hardest challenge in the game, needs to be rewarding to fight. Applying standard drop rates to these bosses doesn't work. A 10% drop rate for a legendary works based on the idea that the farm is quick and relatively easy, so you can do it many times without issue. Raid bosses are not like that, so they need a more rewarding system for their loot. Being guaranteed an item on every kill is a good reward for a fight that might take 10 minutes or more as opposed to a normal enemy that you'll likely farm in about a minute. I think those 4 general loot rarities, being uniques, legendaries, pearls, and seraphs, cover just about everything I want in terms of tiers of loot. But there are other things I want to change about the loot system. A big one would be no more uniques from quest rewards. Quest reward items just lead to read-only or dashboard farming, neither of which are engaging activities. Quest rewards can still have cosmetic or currency rewards, but I don't think they're a good way to obtain gear in the game. Instead, just have an enemy that you fight in the quest that drops the unique item. This still gives it a reason to do side quests. This allows the players to get as many as they want without worry of resetting their playthrough. These would be 33% drop rate items, so they wouldn't be hard to get, and it removes a very tedious and unfun way to farm in the game. I talked about how I think anointments failed as a concept before, so it should be no surprise that I want them to be removed from Borderlands 4. Anointments were overbearing and far too important. I think that's just a flaw of the system. Anointments feel like they can only exist in two ways. The first being that they are so powerful they dominate endgame balancing, and the game becomes far more about your anointments than anything else. The second being that they are so weak that you don't have to pay any thought to them. This is essentially how moonshine effects exist in the pre-sequel. Either way, I don't think they have a place in the game. Borderlands as a series is supposed to be about the uniqueness of the weapons and items through their special effects. So why water this down by adding something that overshadows the weapon effects by being more important? If anything, anointments serve as more of a restriction for creativity, because the developers have to worry about how every anointment is going to interact with every weapon effect and every item effect. In a world where there's only so much time, money, and resources that can be spent on developing the game, I don't think anointments are worth putting the time into. I'd rather see the system scrapped and removed entirely, and those resources be put into other facets of the game. An example of something I'd much rather see them spend time on implementing would be hybrids. Hybrids in Borderlands 1 were an incredibly cool part of the loot system. I don't know if it was something Gearbox even intentionally added, or it was just a product of the Borderlands 1 loot system, but either way, they were a really interesting thing to hunt for in game. One of the issues with putting hybrids in the game would certainly be balancing them. Weapons in Borderlands 1 had a lot simpler effects, so hybrids weren't inherently broken. For example, the Bone Shredder Savior is basically just a regular Bone Shredder that regens ammo, which isn't the most broken thing in the world. On the other hand, you have something like the Ajax Ogre, a hybrid of the Ajax Spear and the Ogre, which basically just meant stacking damage boosts on top of each other, leading to an incredibly powerful weapon. So I'd love to see hybrids return, but I think they would need very careful decision making and testing to make sure these weapons don't turn into something so powerful that they steamroll the whole game. Essentially, this all comes together to make a loot system that features dedicated drops with low but fair drop rates, hybrids, the removal of anointments, and several different rarities that serve to satisfy different aspects of farming. Farming is a key aspect of a looter shooter and should be viewed as a positive and encouraged part of the gameplay. That covers pretty much everything. We've talked about the story, gameplay, difficulty, and the loot system. To me, if Gearbox nails these four things and provides the game with a decent amount of content, then it could easily be the best game in the series. One that would hopefully appeal to every part of the community while still remaining true to what a Borderlands game should be. But what do you think? Do you agree with my takes? Do you disagree? Do you want to just tell me that I'm wrong for fun? Feel free to leave a comment below and let me know what your thoughts are. And if you like the content, feel free to subscribe. Also, you can follow me on Twitch. I'm active there almost every single day. Thanks so much for watching.